Okay, Wesley, we're going to go now.
Great.
Bonjour tout le monde, bienvenue chez Sparabol. Mon nom, c'est Vicky Chêné-Gagnon. Je suis la directrice de la programmation artistique ici à Sparabol. Et je suis jointe de mon collègue Yann Saint-Onge, qui est chercheur sur le chantier IA. So, welcome to Sparabol. My name is Vicky Chêné-Gagnon. I am the programming director here at Sparabol, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Wesley Goatley today. Alors, Wesley Goatley, c'est un artiste critique et un chercheur basé à Londres, au Royaume-Uni. Dans cette conférence qu'il nous présentera aujourd'hui, il présentera et critiquera certaines des tendances dominantes actuelles de l'art et de l'IA et de la culture de design, en exposant leur relation avec les politiques et les injustices plus larges de l'IA, l'exploitation du travail et du capitalisme extractif. Wesley va jaser pour 45 minutes et il y aura une période de questions après. Le travail de Wesley porte sur les technologies de l'intelligence artificielle et leur relation avec la société, la géopolitique et la crise climatique, ainsi que sur la manière dont la pratique artistique peut intervenir et explorer ces outils et ces sujets. Ces installations, performances et films sont présentés dans des lieux internationaux tels que I-Beam à New York, Berghain à Berlin et le Nam June Paik Art Center et le Victoria et Albert Museum à Londres. Il a 25 ans d'expérience en tant qu'artiste expérimental et musique itinérant. Il est titulaire d'un doctorat en esthétique critique des données de l'Université de Sussex et est directeur intérimaire du programme de design d'interaction et de communication visuelle au London College of Communication, University of Arts, London. So Wesley Goatley is a critical artist and researcher based in London, UK. In this talk today, he will present and critique some of the existing dominant trends in AI art and design culture, exposing their relationships to the wider politics and injustices of AI, labor exploitation, and extractive capitalism. In response, he will propose alternate forms of AI art practice that challenge these dominant narratives and propose more creative futures for our engagement with AI tools. His work examines artificial intelligence technologies and their relation to society, geopolitics, and the climate crises, and how art practice can intervene and explore these tools and topics. His installations, performances, and films are shown at international venues such as I-Beam in New York, Berghain in Berlin, the Nam June Paik Art Center in Seoul, and the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. He has a 25-year background as an experimental performer and touring musician. Wesley holds a doctorate in critical data aesthetics from the University of Sussex and is acting program director of interaction design and visual communication at the London School of Communication, University of Arts, London. So we will start in a brief moment, but I will invite my colleague Yann Saint-Onge, researcher on the Chantier IA, to present a little bit about our current work here at Sparabol in artificial intelligence.
Bonjour. Donc, la présentation d'aujourd'hui s'inscrit dans le cadre du Chantier IA, qui est un cycle de 3 ans à Sparabol où on s'intéresse à l'intelligence artificielle dans la création artistique. Dans le cadre de ce chantier, on a des artistes en résidence. C'est la fin cet automne de la première année de résidence. Il y en aura 2 autres qui vont suivre. Il y a d'ailleurs un appel en cours jusqu'au 31 octobre pour les artistes qui seraient intéressés à envoyer un dossier. On fait aussi des expositions en galerie avec des artistes qui travaillent sur l'intelligence artificielle. Et mon rôle est aussi de faire de la recherche en parallèle aux activités de création. Donc, je documente et j'essaie de comprendre ce qui se passe quand les artistes sont en résidence ici pour voir c'est quoi les enjeux de l'IA en création et quel est le changement de paradigme s'il y en a un qui est en train de s'opérer. My name is Yann Saint-Onge. I'm a researcher here at Sparabol. This activity today is part of the Chantier IA, a cycle of 3 years during which we are interested in the intersection of art and AI. We have artist residencies. The first year is ending this fall, and we will have 2 more years with artists in residence. We also have art exhibitions in a gallery where we exhibit different kind of works using AI. And we have artist talks and scholar talks also, like today. My role at Sparabol is to follow the artist and try to understand how AI is impacting the creative process. What are the new issues? Is there any paradigm shift in aesthetics and art creation? So that's in this context that we are pleased to receive this artist talk today with Wesley Goatley. Thank you.
So Wesley, we are bringing it over to you. Thanks so much for this again.
Thank you. Thank you for the lovely, generous introduction and the invitation. It's always a pleasure to come and talk about this topic. Can everyone see my screen okay? I've just put shared screen on. Can you see that okay over there, Vicky?
Oh, the reading is fine.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So today I'm going to be giving a talk called Demand No Automation Towards Progressive AI Art. And I put progressive in inverted commas there because I'm thinking about progressive in a number of different ways here, but really about the kind of social cultural progression and what that might mean and what we might want that to mean. So we already had a pretty thorough overview of what I do, but I've been working in this space for quite some time. My first work around AI and art practice with my own work was a piece called The Dark Age of Connectionism. This was the first iteration of this was 2017. It was looking at the Amazon Echo specifically and its relationship to various forms of surveillance capitalism that were dominant and emerging through the field of AI right now, the sort of stuff that is now quite everyday to us, but back in those days, the Amazon Echo was a bit of an early harbinger of that kind of crossover between surveillance capitalism and AI and algorithmic capitalism. Works like Echo Rain, which was a speculative design project that was following the US military's design strategies for how they make telecommunications equipment, trying to redesign an Amazon Echo to meet that as a way of trying to speculate about what the relationship right now is between Amazon and the US military when they work so closely with each other, much like many tech companies around the world do with the militaries they relate to and have always had funding from, etc., particularly in the field of AI, which, as most scholars of AI would know, has been for a long time closely related to the fields of military research. Chthonic Rights was a project I showed in a number of different places. I think this photo might be from Namur in Belgium. And it was kind of like a haunted smart desk where a collection of various kind of quote unquote smart technologies that have built-in voice assistants were sort of having odd conversations with each other, mostly about the absurdity of assuming that these voices are friendly and in any way alive and anything other than kind of signals or agents of different and new and emergent forms of capitalism. This project Cathonia with Sugwen Chung, I'm speaking into Canada. I thought I should include collaboration with at least one Canadian as part of it. Sugwen is a Canadian-born Chinese practitioner, and they did the visuals for this performance that was shown at Berghain in Berlin, which was a live audiovisual performance, narrativizing some of the themes of the work I've been doing around critiquing the long histories and politics of technologies like Siri, for example. A project like Newly Forgotten Technologies. This was quite a large installation, about 50 square meters. There's about 6 tons of dirt in this image. And it was simulating an e-waste landfill, so an e-waste dump site where a lot of consumer trash has been thrown away, and quite a lot of it are smart technologies, quote unquote smart technologies, that have voice assistants embedded. And these voice assistants were talking about the reasons why they had been thrown away, both kind of speculative stories from the present, but also from the future about why we might want to cast off these particular devices. And that's been extended into a piece I've just released, which is an album / audiobook, I guess. It's called Newly Forgotten Technology: Stories from AI-Free Futures, and it's a collection of speculative fiction, short stories, different stories about different futures where we might want to abandon, ban, move past, or just forget this current era of AI hype and hyperbole that we find ourselves in. And this is available on Bandcamp right now, and is scored with a soundtrack. It's each talk or each story is narrated by one of the machinic voices inherent to our digital devices today: Siri, Google Assistant, Alexa. And the soundtrack itself is a kind of an acousmatic dissembling of those voices. So the soundtrack is composed from the voices themselves, kind of distorted out of all visibility, and their kind of dishumanness amplified through that. So because I'm talking about AI today, I always like to start with a very important preface, and that is that artificial intelligence does not exist, even though I've said it about 8 times today, and it's already been said probably about 50 other times today in the gallery. So what I mean by that is the things that we have around us right now that are commonly referred to as artificial intelligence are not really artificial intelligence, in the sense that they're not artificial general intelligence, which is the term nowadays used to kind of clarify what we have now, versus the kind of speculative future technology where we might replicate intelligence artificially and create human-like or beyond human technologies. We haven't done that now, and I'm of the position that we won't ever do it, as is most of the fields of philosophy and many different fields of study of intelligence that can't agree on what intelligence is, let alone how we could replicate it. But as a kind of a useful framing of what we mean by what we have now versus this other thing called artificial intelligence that does not exist. So what we have now is often called narrow AI or weak AI sometimes, which is a fairly recent phrase used to, again, describe what we have, because it's not AI. So it can do specific tasks only. You know, ChatGPT can't drive a car, for example. It's limited by training data and algorithms. ChatGPT can only reproduce some sort of semblance of what's already in its database and what it's been algorithmically programmed to do. Its capacities are determined by human engineers. So the people at OpenAI determine, a very small group of people at OpenAI realistically determine how a tool like ChatGPT works. I'm referencing OpenAI and ChatGPT only because they are the biggest company in this space, arguably, or rather Microsoft is, who kind of realistically owns ChatGPT. And so they're a useful kind of model we're talking about, but much what I've talked about here today will be applicable to any kind of generative AI company or AI company in this space that follows these sorts of practices. It's not intelligent. ChatGPT does not meet any framing of what can be largely agreed to be intelligence. It's certainly not human-like intelligence. You have to really bend the notion of what intelligence is to make it fit something like ChatGPT, which is quite a sort of simple tool when you break it down. It does exist, though. You have not dreamed ChatGPT. You haven't imagined it. Artificial intelligence, or artificial general intelligence, AGI, this speculative technology that currently only exists in science fiction, would adapt to any task. So the AI ChatGPT would be able to drive a car, much like we can learn how to drive cars. It's self-learning and evolving in the same way that we self-learn and we evolve. I can decide to learn how to drive a car. I did about 20 years ago. It would be able to expand its own capacities, so it would be able to change its own code in order to be able to learn how to drive a car, much like we can expand our capacities. It would be intelligent because if it can do all those things, it's at least as intelligent as us. However, it does not exist, arguably will never exist. How can we reproduce intelligence if we can't agree what it is? I won't get bogged down in that discussion today, but it's worth looking into. There's a lot of other people who share that position. For the benefit of my talk, and full apologies to people who disagree with this position, you know, you're allowed to, it's fine. And we can have a big conversation about it afterwards. But if AI then doesn't exist, what is it? If it's not a real technology, if it's a speculative thing that exists in science fiction and we have something else now, I think it's better to think of AI not as a technology, but as a brand. In that sense, it makes a lot of sense, and it really does exist. Like all brands, it isn't a thing, it's an idea used to sell things. So much like Coke isn't really a drink because you can write Coke on a hat, and then that hat is worth, or perceived to be worth, slightly more than a hat without Coke written on it, right? So these brands are ideas that are applied to objects and used to inflate their value. And we can see that widely in the world of AI today. We know that there are many companies right now attempting to shoehorn AI into things because they know if they put AI on it, it will inflate its value in some sense. So in that sense, it's best to think of AI not as a technology, but as a brand. And I'll come back to that idea a bit later. So when I said progressive at the start of this, what I'm talking about is, for the rest of the talk, we'll be kind of framing some things and some trends within largely visual culture that I consider to be regressive, in the sense that they're kind of either holding us back or sending us back to an earlier time, things that we want to leave behind, basically. So I'm going to frame quite three different trends, each one as being kind of regressive, and then I'm going to propose how a kind of progressive response to that trend, what that could look like and does look like within practice. So I'm going to be highlighting practitioners and actual works to be able to say, like, this is how we can do it sort of differently. There's going to be a couple of jokes. There's going to be some pretty miserable stuff I talk about here. But, you know, that's the world. It's sometimes funny, sometimes miserable. That's humanity for you. Okay, so the first regressive is the idea that our art is just an advertisement for algorithmic capitalism. So I see this around a lot. For those of you who have any sort of interest or have been paying any amount of attention to the way that other practitioners or any practitioners use AI out in the world, you'll be familiar with this framing. Goodness, did, why, and this is what it did. We've all seen this. Social media is full of this. I asked AI to make a video of what it looks like when Harry Potter characters go to the rave. And this is what it showed me. You know, I asked AI to show me Marvel films, but, you know, set in 14th century Europe or something, you know. It's very, very common. This was just like the kind of first snapshot on Google that I found. I asked AI to create Lego sets of blah, 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 blah. We've all seen it, I'm sure. It's super popular. I Googled the phrase, I asked AI to, and it came up with about 2.5 billion results. Paradoxically, these days, probably quite a lot of those are in some sense automated AI generated slop. But there you go. Now, my issue with that framing, the I asked AI to, and it did this, totally sublimates the practitioner in that process, right? It's just like, I asked AI, this magic AI, to do this, and it did this. It really reduces the labor and intention and interpretation of the practitioner in that process entirely. I mean, as practitioners in general, we should just be avoiding any kind of those sorts of narratives. But with this one, you know, it really just suggests that, like, the magic robot made my art for me. And those narratives, I think, are really problematic, because what they do is they kind of only sheen the work, or the work itself is cloaked in the sheen of, look how fantastic this tool is. I just asked it to do this and it magically came out with this stuff. Look how amazing this is. It really foregrounds, promotes the tool. And the issue here is that generative AI tools, AI in general, but generative AI tools specifically, are at the center of a set of global power systems of exploitation and extraction. This is why we shouldn't be wanting to sort of highlight and non-critically promote the affordances of these technologies, which I believe is what happens and what is being done when someone just says, I asked my magic AI to do this, and, you know, or I asked AI to write a poem for me, or my AI writes my poetry for me, etc., etc. So to look at a platform like DALL-E, this is OpenAI's text to image platform, if anybody's used it. where you simply type in a prompt and it generates an image based on that prompt input. Now, obviously, this is in itself a technology that disempowers artists because there's no amount of control you really have over this tool. How it works is completely opaque. The decisions made behind it, there's no settings to adjust, etc. It's a very disempowering tool to be using, I think. And one of the aspects about this tool itself and large swathes of the field of generative AI, not all of it, but certainly the major players we can think of, and certainly if you've been using these tools out in the world, you've probably interacted with companies like Midjourney, for example, is that there is a huge intellectual property problem here. Problem is a very light way to put it. I would say that these companies are at the center of the largest exploitation and theft of art in the history of the world. I don't think that's hyperbolic to say. Companies like OpenAI and others built these systems, which algorithmically are not very complicated. You know, the algorithmic systems, the actual kind of logical functioning of them, we've had for a very long time. You know, the field of computer generated images has had a lot of these algorithmic systems for at least 20 years, arguably, when we used to call it informatics back in the good old days. But really what's changed is the databases. The fact they managed to capture so much data, to load it into the database, that's been really the shift that we've seen in the last few years. Those databases came explicitly from hoovering up all of the images that we were putting online for the last 20-ish years of social media. So there's a lot that's going on legally with this, people trying to sue companies like OpenAI to try to get damages out of them for saying you've taken all of this artwork, all these images, all of this text that you found from all over the internet. You didn't ask consent for it. And now you're making tools which you have the gall to ask us to pay for. So the tools are nothing. They really can't function without these data sets. Data sets are the most kind of key aspect of those technologies, I would say. And it's built entirely on stolen labor, the stolen work of artists, the things we've been uploading daily for years and years, just kind of hoovered up wholesale from as many different parts of the internet as possible. Now, there's different forms of, that's one aspect of this exploitation. And there's other forms of exploitation that go along with that. So, for example, a company like Sama, previously called Samasource, who are based in Kenya, they work for a lot of companies, including Facebook, including OpenAI, a lot of different companies, Alibaba as well. And they do data cleaning in effect. They go through these large data sets that are kind of collected by companies like OpenAI, and they try to filter out all of the really horrific, offensive, violent, sexually explicit imagery or text in them. So imagine that the OpenAI just hoovering up all this stuff from places like 4chan and as well as social media and all these everywhere they could find it from, news websites, etc., magazines. They get it all together. You need to go through it if you don't want to make a tool that kind of like spits out racist, horrific stuff all the time, which is obviously a decent chunk of the internet is full of that. Then you need to pay people to go through it, humans going through it basically line by line to try to find and flag these awful things. Now, imagine if this was your job, that you spent every day looking at the worst images and the worst text hour after hour. If you imagine that job, you will not be surprised that companies like Sama employ quite large psychological teams on site. It's apparently quite common to get PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, from doing this job. They're paid less than $2 an hour, which in Kenya isn't actually bad money. However, these companies are specifically using Kenya because obviously it is cheaper and the labor laws are more flexible than they are in different parts of the world. So there is an exploitation there based on the kind of geopolitics of that space. Companies like OpenAI, but as I said at the start, the tech industry around the world is forever kind of connected to the military-industrial complex. OpenAI at the start of this year and in previous years, they had a line in their terms and conditions that said, we promise never to use our AI tools for military use. We promise never to do this. January the 16th, I think it was, no, January the 9th, they said, actually, we're going to change our terms and conditions. And they quietly removed that line from it that said, we won't work with militaries. The day after that, they announced a rather large new partnership with the US military. Surprise, surprise. So these are companies that we can't trust. The relationships with the military go deeper, particularly with a company like OpenAI. Again, I don't really think OpenAI are particularly special. They don't practice their craft in a way that's particularly outside of the way that a lot of the tech industry works, particularly in the West. But they currently, or this year in June, I think it was, they appointed Paul Nakasone, the ex-head of the National Security Agency. Yes, that National Security Agency of the US, the famous NSA. He was also a general in the kind of cyber warfare division of the US military before that. And he's now on OpenAI's board. So this is a company that is fully embedded within the military industrial complex. Again, like a lot of the tech landscape has been for a long time, particularly the field of AI. There's other aspects of extractivism and exploitation that are worth our attention here and worth thinking about, you know, do we want to amplify these things through our work? So the ecological cost of generative AI is finally getting some very good press these days, I think. This piece by Kate Crawford came out earlier on in the year, exposing the insane, brutal amount of carbon and water, the carbon cost and kind of water cost predominantly of both cooling data centers, training AI models, everything to do with building like training or doing anything with generative AI is just so insanely carbon intensive. It's one of the most carbon intensive forms of computation we have ever created in the age of climate crisis. There's also this year AI recently announced that they've actually seen a 48% year-on-year increase between this year and last year in their carbon emissions specifically attached to AI training, and that's only going up. You know, that's Google trying to catch up with Microsoft in effect. You know, Microsoft Azure's carbon use is insane. You know, these are like incredible. These are the exact things we didn't want to be doing at this time in human history, in effect. And so when we frame our work as basically being like, oh, here's this kind of like nice, cheery AI. The AI has made my art. The AI drew this picture. The AI wrote this poetry, etc., etc. I think it's a really damaging narrative. And our art should be more than a tech demo. It should be more than just say, here's what the tool was designed to do. Isn't it great that it works like this? Not when there's all of these bodies and all of this exploitation behind those tools. No technology is neutral, and it's very easy to see the non-neutrality of those technologies. So what I describe as a progressive response to this situation, to that very common narrative, which I'm sure that everyone watching this has heard in their time, is to instead frame our art so that it targets and exposes algorithmic capitalism and its kind of related capitalisms. So a great example of this, I think, is in Qingyi Ren's work, See My Gender. So Qingyi is a practitioner currently based halfway between Basel and Linz in Austria. And they made a work where they took a very popular facial recognition system, very common one, Amazon Recognition it's called, trained it on themselves, and these systems, as part of what they're designed to do by the largely, in Amazon's case, largely white male engineering teams, is classify people into being either male or female, as if gender was a binary and not a spectrum, and that you can only be one of those two things. So Qingyi is a non-binary practitioner, and it was very critical of that normalization of binary gender identity, and that's kind of built into those tools that get deployed around the world and used both at kind of government level and private levels as well. And so they did this performance where they're putting things on their face to try to, in kind of quote unquote, trick the system into registering their face either as being 100% definitely male or 100% definitely female. Now, what's interesting, I think, about this work is a couple of things. Is one, rather than saying, wow, look how great this tool is, Qingyi's work is saying, wow, look how easy it is to break this thing. You know, look how flimsy it is, look how fragile it is, look how much friction we can bring into it just by sticking things on my face. But Qingyi's life as a non-binary person kind of comes through, and they're very public about this in a discussion about the work. Otherwise, I wouldn't kind of foreground their identity. It's their identity, that they're, you know, it's their private business basically. But in this work, you know, it makes sense to raise it because at various points in this kind of 7-minute long piece, which you can find online, as Chingy attempts to perform particular ends of the gender spectrum, you can really see their discomfort and somewhat dysphoria, kind of algorithmic dysphoria coming through as they're trying to perform a gender they do not want to be associated with. And you really get grounded, you know, their starkness, just their face and kind of like stripped of all other clothing, their exposingness to us, I think is very generous, very brave. And this work kind of really benefits from being grounded in them rather than the tool. You know, it's not foregrounding the tool, it's foregrounding their experience of navigating this tool. Which uses a technology like this without having to say, you know, what does AI think about gender or something? You know, they're not interested in that narrative at all. So I think this is really compelling work and a compelling example of how to kind of present more critical work in this space. So the next regressive of the three kind of regressive trends that I see is this one. And anybody, again, paying attention or looking at any artwork right now, or quite a lot of artwork that foregrounds its use of AI, it will probably use a phrase like the AI is thinking, the AI is learning, it knows, it's dreaming, the AI is making art, the AI is making poetry. You know, these are very common terms, unfortunately, within this space. We see it at very substantial levels. People like Aidan Meller. Aidan Meller is a man who got a 2D plotter arm. You can see it kind of at the bottom of the photo there. 2D plotter, quite an old technology, realistically, with a kind of a microphone, a speech-to-text system. It's not very good speech-to-text system, and a text-to-speech system, effectively like an Amazon Echo or something similar, or Siri. And then he got a mannequin that he decided to make it a female mannequin and put a wig on it. And, you know, he must have chosen that wig and put that dress on the mannequin. That's a weird, when you think about that, he went to the shops and bought a dress for his mannequin and decided what skin color was going to make it, decided it was going to be female for one thing, female coded, and put a wig on it and call it Ada. His name's Aidan. Ada. I know Ada Lovelace, but it's his name, basically. And he refers to it as the world's first AI artist. It's not, it's a plotter with a mannequin on it. It's not even, it's definitely not the first mannequin with a plotter arm attached to it even. In his words, in his own words, it's both mind-blowing and groundbreaking stuff. Anybody who's a student of patriarchy in any sense will not think that this notion is mind-blowing or groundbreaking in any sense. It's retrading extremely old, very boring politics out in the world. But you know, if he just said, I've got a 2D plotter, it's drawing some pictures. No, people say, no, it's not. You've just programmed a 2D plotter. But if he puts a wig on it and calls it an AI robot, then you get press, you know. Another person who I think does a lot of kind of similar work and kind of exploits these whole like AI's dreaming, knowing, thinking narratives is Refik Anadol. Refik Anadol is a very well-known figure within kind of mainstream AI art and digital art in general, I think. He makes works like this. This was a piece that was installed in the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And it was basically the data set was a bunch of pictures from the MoMA, and he generated a kind of digital collage out of it. Now, he didn't say that. He said that this is the AI dreaming about the art in the gallery. I mean, it's not, it doesn't dream, it's not alive. Artificial intelligence does not exist. But again, if he just said, I've made a big lava lamp that I'm projecting on the wall and it's a digital collage, you know that he wouldn't get these sorts of opportunities. But that framing of it is clearly something that he's exploiting. Now, I've got a bigger issue with Refik because this is another one of his work. It largely looks the same aesthetically. It's quite a shallow approach, I think. It's a very expensive plugin, this one, though. So, you know, I think they're about £40,000 just the plugin that does this effect. But this work was shown somewhere else, and this one's about nature, as you can see, because it's got a lot of green in it, and green's the color of nature, as everyone knows, and any artwork with green in it is about nature. Now, what's galling about this, going back to what I was discussing about generative AI and its impact on the climate, is that this is like a K projection I would imagine. Huge computational stack to train the model and to run it live in the room constantly. How dare you make a work like this and claim that you're doing something that's meant to uplift nature? I think that's kind of like a pretty sick thing to do. But to return back to the notion that AI is not a technology, it's a brand. I mean, both of those projects, they're not interesting. I would argue aesthetically or conceptually, the only thing that's interesting about it is the fact that they frame it as being the product of dreaming, hallucinating AI. Again, this one specifically, he says this is an AI dreaming of nature. Again, when you're burning so much carbon, you don't get to talk about nature in your work, I would say. It's an idea used to sell things. And we see this again and again in the field of AI art. And I ask you to next time look at an artwork that claims that an AI did it or something and think, would this artwork be interesting if it didn't have that attached to it? Because quite a lot of it just isn't, unfortunately. But the narrative of not only that it's kind of like it's doing human things like dreaming, etc., isn't just where it stops, because quite a lot of the narrative extends past that and implies that these kind of quote unquote AI, artificial intelligence, doesn't exist. These things aren't that. But AI is somehow beyond human, and we see a lot of examples of people saying it's beyond human, it's superhuman, it's super intelligence, blah blah blah. Again, the real super intelligence only exists in science fiction, arguably will never exist. But this is a narrative that is exploited by very powerful actors. This is why we should care. I don't really care that much about what just some artists are doing, even if I find it kind of insulting. I'm like, that doesn't get me out of bed, but this stuff does. So borders around the world, including the US, but not only, many, many other borders do this, use kind of is AI enabled to do quote unquote predictive assessments, which is basically to look at as much data as they can find on you and attempt to ascertain whether or not they think you might be a problem in this country or not. Unfortunately, for a lot of countries around the world, particularly in the global north, it's effectively how brown are you and how close can we pin you to anybody who might identify as of Islamic faith. It really does come down to scraping social media contacts for those sorts of information. Just a side note to say, we owe the golden age of Baghdad here in the West an uncalculable debt for basically bringing science and discovering so much and rediscovering so much of our past and bringing it to us in Baghdad in the 9th to 11th centuries. And it's a real crime of history that right now these people are treated in this way. But side point. So AI is implicated in this, and this notion of predicting the future, because supposedly it can do this because of its beyond humanness, right? Because obviously humans can't do that, but this smart AI can. This is exploited very explicitly in a tool like predictive policing. This is just one of them. It's being deployed around the world. I'm pretty sure that someone might be able to correct me. I'm pretty sure that Toronto had one of this as part of the whole Toronto smart city stuff. I know you folks probably don't like Toronto, so you don't mind me kind of like going in on them on the call, but I'm fairly certain there was a predictive policing system being tested as part of that whole stuff that was going on over there. But predictive policing is a tool where you take the kind of racist data that police have collected throughout a city, try to work out what crimes are going to happen tomorrow based on what crimes happened yesterday. And it's not only you who thinks that sounds stupid. Professor Nicholas Corsaro, who built the crime database that this particular system was built on, he also believes that trying to predict who is going to do what based on last year's data is just horseshit. Good, serious STEM commentary there from our friends over in STEM. But again, that notion of prediction of beyond human capacity comes from this supposed magic of AI, the supposedly that it can, that it knows, it thinks, it's thinking, it's learning, it's making art, etc., etc. There's I could pick many, many more examples of where this narrative is being exploited and the dangers of it. One of the dangers is in the kind of, burgeoning or struggling field of autonomous vehicles, quote unquote, autonomous vehicles. My favorite writing on this is done by Maya Indira Ganesh, who's just about to publish a new monologue on this topic. It's excellent. Keep an eye out for it. But for example, the databases that these systems are trained on contain so few dark-skinned people that the cars themselves do not register dark-skinned people as human the streets, which is as dangerous as it sounds. And then, of course, the kind of magic or cloaking of AI to do these beyond human things it has been exploited by the IDF. I don't think they are by far the only military organization to do this, but with their lavender target acquisition system, which was supposedly using AI to kind of guess whether or not Hamas are going to be in a building here or there, in effect to just kind of like legitimize the generation of civilian targets. Again, the militaries have got such a long relationship to AI. It's unsurprising these things happen. I think we're going to see an increasing rise of this in the next few years in the kind of conflicts to come. So amplifying the narratives of human-like or beyond human capacities empowers forces of domination and disempowers us, framing these things as being able to do these tricks of even human-like intelligence only amplifies all those other systems that disempower us and put our bodies and bodies of other people around the world at risk. We shouldn't be amplifying them. People like Aidan Meller and Refik Anadol are part of that discussions, particularly when they're at that level of visibility. They've got a responsibility, I think. I have said this to Refik and he didn't have much come back on it, but that's fine. So a progressive response to this is to instead say that rather than the AI is thinking, learning, knowing, dreaming, making art, to ground ourselves, to ground the fact that there is an artist thinking, learning, knowing, dreaming, and making art with or through these tools. Great example of this, again, the Canadians return. It's Su Gwen Chung's work, or Sao Guan for any Cantonese speakers in the room. Su Gwen's work is a really interesting example. I would hope that people are reasonably familiar with Su Gwen's work. But for those who are not, Su Gwen is a drawer, a fine artist, had a whole kind of history, as many artists do, of their own kind of practice. In Su Gwen's case, there was lots and lots of drawings that they'd done over their kind of creative life. And they trained a kind of like a style GAN system on reproducing images in the style of this corpus, this database, which was their own work. They're not doing what OpenAI do and steal everyone else's work, or even use tools that are built and trained on stealing everyone else's work. They built their own, and they use a robot arm to basically output those images, so that in some sense they're kind of like drawing together with the robot arm. But really what they're doing is drawing together with their own history of practice, which is really fascinating. Now, Su Gwen's the first person to be asked, is the robot the artist? And Su Gwen's the first person to say, no, I built it and trained it. Of course, it's not some sort of, artificial intelligence. It's just a robot arm doing what I've programmed to do. But again, I think Su Gwen's work grounds us in the kind of potentials for these tools to do new and interesting things, like present your own history of practice back to you in this very like physical way, live in the room, that you can then interact with your own history. That is new and interesting. And these aren't niche practices. Like when you Google AI artist, you'll come up with about 3 people at the top results. One of them's Refik, one of them's Su Gwen. These are not practices that are that no one cares about. These things captivate people's imagination. So please, for those of you who are practitioners in the room, don't feel like because it's so easy to see examples of saying, well, I asked my AI to draw pictures for me and it did this, or my AI is dreaming and here's the dreams of my AI. Don't feel seduced into doing that just because these other major visible forces in the field kind of make it look like that's what you've got to do to get ahead, because people like Su Gwen don't, and I think that they arguably make a much richer artistic contribution because of it. So my last regressive point, and I'm keeping my eye on time here, my last regressive point that I want to talk about is quite a major one, is the idea that AI can be creative. People refer to kind of, or ask the question, can AI be creative, or is my AI creative? And the suggestion that it can automate creative labor. Now, the history of automation is a long one. We've got a lot of evidence of it. Again and again and again, automation doesn't free us from labor. Effectively, the history of automation is the history of of wage competition. It's the history of someone producing a tool that does the same job as a human does, but badly, or same job as not a human, a specialist does. Specialist, can weave a beautiful textile. You build a jacquard loom to do the same job quicker, cheaper, not as good. That kind of classic triumvirate of it. Is it quick? Is it cheap? Or is it good? You only ever get two of those things. But what it does is allow for wage competition, because then the person who wants to buy a textile product says, well, the craftsperson wants 10 shekels to do this work. The person who owns the jacquard loom says they'll do it for 3 shekels. So I'll go back to the craftsperson and say, well, I can get it done $3, 3 shekels on the loom. So I'll offer you 6 shekels rather than 10. So it's just a way of really challenging and devaluing labor. And the history of automation shows this again and again and again and again. And then generative AI isn't any different than that. There is some differences, mostly in the fact that every use of a generative AI tool uses training data. So you're actually kind of like, in some sense, improving or refining the tool that is used to challenge your labor every time you use it, which is not how the jacquard loom worked, for example. People behind this are well aware of it. The generative AI field is desperate to try to convince employers largely to use their tools instead of paying people to do it. The now ex-CTO, Mira Murati, who recently left, as a lot of people have quit OpenAI in the last few months, the now ex-CTO recently said, when asked about the kind of creative jobs that tools like Sora, ChatGPT, DALL-E put at risk, she said that maybe those jobs shouldn't have been there in the first place. So a real just dismissal of massive amounts of people's labor, income, wages, etc. And now let's go on to why it can't do these things. What's really kind of going on with these tools. So for those of you who work more technically with generative AI systems, apologies, I'm going to heavily simplify a lot of things here, but I'm going to keep as much kind of technical stuff as I think is useful here. So the way that generative AI technologies largely work is, for those of you, non-technically oriented, it's about producing average outcomes, arguably. It's about saying, let's have a look at this database. I want to kind of generate a story about a dog finding a cat in a river. And what the tool is designed to do is kind of scrape through its massive stolen database, stolen from all of us, and attempt to look for the kind of common average patterns that involve those sorts of words and are kind of constructed in that sort of way and kind of spit them out. So it's kind of like looking for averages, because the assumption being the people who develop these tools, rightly assumed that if a lot of people have written something in this way, then it's probably legibly kind of would be seen as acceptable. So it's looking for the kind of average outcome, the average aspect of the database, and kind of spitting that out. And that might be, if you're saying, well, draw me a picture of, a man wearing a uniform on a horse, you can imagine what that image would look like, because you've seen a lot of similar images. The horse isn't facing straight on, it's facing kind of sidewards. The man's got like a green uniform on, not a blue uniform or a white uniform. There's a kind of like brownish war background in the background. Those are kind of like average trends within aesthetic culture that these tools are designed to basically like isolate and spit out. But it's average in another way as well. It's average in the sense that that process itself is the kind of is what makes it so discreative and so limited as well in relation to ourselves as creative practitioners. There's already an established kind of AI art aesthetic that a lot of people are already bored of and kind of like critiquing. And you get things like very video game looking characters, slightly psychedelic-y looking images, and a lot of intellectual property, because obviously so many images that were stolen from that database were not just from people like us, but also from companies who have output a lot of those things. And it kind of creates this situation where it cannot make anything new necessarily. It just recombines the old. Now, you see this in an example of, if you ask it, if you type in, video game plumber and set that as your kind of input parameter into ChatGPT, it's like I almost said ask it. It's kind of, I have to control and check myself quite a lot with these languages, because they are so, prevalent in culture. But if you type in video game plumber into an image generation system, you're almost definitely going to get Mario, but nothing else. You won't get any like a new type of video game plumber. You'd have to specify basically not Mario a number of levels in order not to get that, because it's only going to kind of spit out the kind of average, the commonalities, the kind of boring stuff, really. What's boring, what's repetitive, what's been done a billion times before. And this is, you know, one of the kind of chief critiques against the notion of AI creativity, generative AI creativity. Again, anyone can speculate as to whether or not AGI would be intelligent or creative. That's fine, but you need to ground yourself in the fact that AGI doesn't exist and probably won't. So how much of a discussion is that really worth having? But what AI doesn't automate then creativity, it automates the kind of spitting out of what we have already done in some sense. But it have the capacity to turn us into machines for fixing machines, which unfortunately is a large and ever increasing kind of situation out in the world. So we're all familiar with images like this, you know, stuff where kind of generative AI images go wrong. In the kind of earlier days, like last year, there was a lot more kind of press about how easy it was to kind of get hands wrong within a generative AI system. Those companies try to put a lot of effort into fixing that and then realize they really couldn't, because you'd still get 3 legs and 2 heads potentially. And what that's created a situation where a lot of people who are being employed to, or were previously employed to generate images, are now being fired and rehired and paid less to fix images from generative AI systems, to, in a sense, make themselves machines doing very repetitive machine-like tasks of just editing out fingers rather than creating an image of a hand. Machines for fixing machines, machines for fixing what will always be inherently sort of broken outputs from generative AI. The phrase hallucination, which some people use to describe the kind of errors of generative AI systems, is a very, very good rebranding of the word failure to do what it was meant to do. There's a lot more press happening around this, a lot more now, particularly in fields like copywriting, lots of fields of text-based work, lots of fields of image-based work, people being fired, rehired, paid less to do a more kind of like dehumanizing job in a sense, you know, that you're no longer asked to be creative, you're asked to be kind of like machinic in a sense. A kind of a dark paradox of the situation we're in. But also the companies who are trying to replace workers by doing this, you know, are attempting to do so to generate short-term income improvements, without any real example of the fact that these systems can do these jobs whatsoever. And in fact, you do need to always re-employ a human to kind of fix these outputs. But also, you know, this kind of boutique lefty organization I found called the International Monetary Fund, you know, recently published a study about how AI and these kind of like hiring and refiring practices look likely to cause kind of like massive economic downturns in the future, because much like we saw with the pandemic, when people were kind of like mass laying off workers, there is a problem in terms of rehiring and struggling to get those workers back, and then struggling with productivity afterwards. And it creates these short-term gains, but mid to long-term massive drops. And there's kind of real worries that there's going to be a huge economic crisis that's driven specifically from this, which is a really kind of, sad/interesting outcome. So my last piece of work I'm going to draw your attention to is this, and the last kind of progressive notion is the idea that our work should instead ground us in humanity and our labor, you know, not the kind of quote unquote labor of machines. Artificial intelligence doesn't exist. It can't be creative. It doesn't have labor. Hopefully that phrase is just burned into your brain if I've done my job right. Artificial intelligence does not exist. I'm going to show a project I did with collaboration between Charlie Peters and Tobias Revel here. This is a piece called Charismatic Megapigment. We made it in 2018. The context is Charlie, who's a formalist painter. I'm a very conceptually driven and process driven artist, so formalism makes no sense to me whatsoever. It just doesn't register in my brain. But Charlie, Dr. Charlie Peters, is a real expert in her craft, and she painted this picture, which to her is simply the color green. There's no other meaning for formalism, you know, there's no other meaning in there other than that. It's just the color green. So she painted a kind of picture that she feels like it's just green, that's all it is, no meaning. So Tobias built this kind of robotic rigging around the outside, and the screen you see in the middle here has got a webcam on the back. That webcam is getting kind of very intimate views of Charlie's brushstrokes. And the top half of the image is what the webcam is kind of picking up, and the bottom half is images that come from a machine learning system that I programmed. I built a database of about 30,000 images that were labeled as the color green on Google and were labeled as being fair use, because I'm not going to steal everyone else's artwork. That's what OpenAI and Midjourney and everybody else does. So I loaded effectively, for those of you who have this sort of background, it was a KNN, a K-nearest network model. And all it's doing basically is trying to match kind of pixel arrangement of what the kind of webcam's picking up to an image in the database and trying to show that image on screen. Now, what that did is these images that were classified by Google as the color green, it shows there's these big political trends within the color green. The color green has a very interesting cultural life right now. So many of the images were starkly images of things like the burning Amazon rainforest. There's loads of those pictures. There were pictures of kind of like quote unquote sustainable products, which we know what color they were, because sustainable products are colored green, because green is the color of nature. And which the white silkworm is annoyed by. Or you saw pictures of politicians stood in front of signs that said like recycle, and you know what color the recycling sign was. Yes, that's right, it's green. So actually green has this very big kind of like political cultural trend right now, which we found very interesting. And so what the system was doing was kind of taking this art object that from Charlie's perspective, the artist's perspective, has no meaning, and drawing our attention to this kind of abstract data set of the color green, but drawing our attention to the way that interpretation kind of can allow us to make new kind of connections in aesthetic culture, you know, to notice things that are happening and notice trends in certain directions, even in the most abstract kind of contexts. Now, what we never said was, here's what the AI thinks about art. Now, we probably would have made more money if we'd done that, especially this was made in 2018. We released that in 2022 and said we made a machine to look at art and tell us what the machine thinks about art. We would have made more money, but then we wouldn't have been able to sleep at night, because none of us felt that that was a narrative that we could live with, because we share these sorts of similar politics. Tobias is currently in the process of finishing a really great, very design-led PhD about the way that design and AI kind of narratives cross over, and the way that kind of design obfuscates the function and amplifies myths and magical narratives around AI. Do check out Tobias's work, and Charlie's as well, if you like the aesthetics of this image, because she's a great artist. So to finish, so just say one more thing about this. You know, this is an example of what I'm saying about grounding us in both artists, humanity, the kind of complexity of us, complexity of visual culture, of humans. We don't need to talk about AI or machines in any way to do this. These tools were only mechanisms to highlight what's going on in the world, and that's what was interesting about it. So to finish, my last point is that all AI art is art about AI. Now, what I mean by that is that if you're making an artwork about any topic, could be any topic you want, but you foreground the use of AI tools within it. So you say this uses this AI tool to do X. You are in some sense contributing to your audience's perception of what AI is and can do. And there's a responsibility there, because that means that your art is both about whatever it is it's about, but it's also about AI in a sense, because it is informing the audience about AI, or it's editing or inflecting their knowledge of it. And I think we have a real responsibility, particularly at a cultural moment when we're back in an AI summer, which is the kind of historical trend where AI gets popular. Before, historically, they overpromised, underdelivered. People stopped taking it seriously, and the military pulled funding. That's called an AI winter. This one will be longer this time, I think. But you know, we're in the AI summer right now, which means that there is a lot of hunger for these things. So there's a real opportunity to make a point, to draw attention to some of these things, some of these wider politics going out in the world. As I showed with the three examples of practice, there's loads of different ways and interesting ways to ground ourselves, or draw our attention to different things outside of the tools, to not center those tools and instead use them to talk about more interesting things than just what some tools and technology are doing right now. And I think it's a really wonderful moment, and we should take that responsibility, but also that opportunity to do something good with the art that we make. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wesley. That was fantastic. Thank you. I've got a couple questions lined up in the room adjacent to the vivarium where I am right now. So I'm going to invite those people to come into the room here and ask their questions. And in the interim, I just wanted to say thank you. That was really fascinating. I really appreciated the way you ended on the artwork that you collaborated on. That's like a really good reminder of where we're coming from and where we're going. So thanks so much for that. I've got my colleague Yann Saint-Onge here who has a question. So I'm going to let him join me and ask.
Great. Hi, Jan.
Hi, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I was wondering, even if you try to avoid generative AI and all what you call AI branding, don't you think working with AI in your artworks participate somehow in a general AI actual coolness, which is the regressive part you were talking about? And do you consider it is a media in itself in your practice, or is it just a tool? AI, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think of them as tools because, you know, if we think of the laptop as a tool and the software within the laptop as a tool and not media, obviously you could, I would accept the definition of software as media, and obviously plenty of people use that. I think that it's slightly more obfuscating because it's such an uncommon framing of it. But instead of to be like, well, the software is a tool to produce the work in a sense. So I'm more comfortable to frame it as a tool. I like referring it to a tool over and over again because a lot of people refer to AI as an it or as an entity or as an agent or as a collaborator or something. And obviously I'm very, as you can probably tell, I'm very opposed to those narratives because I think they do bad things. They're misleading and misrepresenting what that technology actually is, and B, you know, those narratives aren't our own. They're somebody else's narrative that we reinforce every time we use that framing. So I'm kind of very cautious about how I describe those things in the language I use. So I would always use it as a tool, or describe as a tool, because I do think of them in my own work as tools. You know, they're always towards an outcome. But again, in the same way that a computer or software is, because obviously it is just software running on a computer. You know, it might be the computer isn't my computer in my house. It might be the computer owned by Microsoft or an AWS server somewhere. You know, but it's still just a computer somewhere burning carbon.
But is it possible to be in a progressive part of your speech? I mean, if you're doing artworks using AI, isn't it part of the coolness of it and its branding?
The co-ness, do you mean? As in like kind of as in collaborate?
Coolness, being
Coolness.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that for some people, well, I think for a lot of people, there is clearly that there's those trends and those brands they are latching onto, which is why so many people say, I asked AI to do X and it did Y, you know, and it is a kind of a cool thing. In terms of my use within my practice, I mean, you know, I got interested in it at a time when I was already doing a lot of work about the kind of more nested politics or less visible politics in a lot of everyday objects. And I could really see that crossover between like what was coming with the AI stuff, particularly around, you know, early on with voice assistants, and being like, oh, this is just the next iteration of those sets of politics, but it's got the kind of risk to go a lot worse. So I always say that I work a lot with AI and I hate it, which is it's not pleasant as a practitioner to do so. You know, I don't sit around every day and go, great, I can't wait to be embedded around these tools. I own like 60 broken Amazon Echoes and I hate the Amazon Echo with a passion. You know, it's an awful object that is a locus of so much that's wrong with algorithmic capitalism and extractive capitalism. And yet I'm surrounded by them all the time. But I make work not because I'm interested in self-expression, but because I'm like, I think these narratives are important and it helps me get up in the morning to feel that I'm trying to, you know, draw attention to these things that I think more people should be drawing attention to. So I find it exhausting to work with them and unpleasant, but I imagine some people just find it cool, and to some degree, I'm jealous of them because I'm like, must be nice to feel really buoyed by that way by your own practice, because I find it really tiring a lot of the time.
Yeah, thank you.
I have another question coming in here from our director, Eric Desmarais.
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
It was really, really interesting. I have a strange question. I will try to formulate it the most clearly possible. We hear a lot of things about the copyright violation of all those AI things, and artists are fighting everywhere. But I'm really kind of, I don't know. I think it's really a strange question if we are anti-capitalism. There's this idea that copyright is like a tools for artists and other creative producer. Let's name them like this, to modify their work for it to work in a capitalist world. So what is our position as anti-capitalists on this copyright fighting going on right now? It's really, I don't know. I'm not really, I don't know what to think about it, actually.
I think it's really interesting because the cultural narrative has flipped quite dramatically, right? I mean, there was a point where 25 years ago, people like Lars Ulrich from Metallica made a very bad name for himself by coming out against Napster, right? Where everyone was like, "Shut up! I want my music." It's like, and those things are very much sort of seen as being anti kind of like people in some sense. Copyright was a tool for another system, but actually these days with the mass copyright infringement that's been exploited by companies, social media companies for a long time, right? In terms of the media we've uploaded, we don't really own anymore, and it's just a kind of a source for data exploitation. But now it's interesting to see that narratives shift, and there's much more. I mean, there was always a copy left movement, obviously, and I think copy left has always been a really interesting movement. But I see much more now, a lot more organizations that have been going for a long time, but are getting a lot more press and visibility for framing themselves as kind of like defending the rights of artists. That they're asserting copyright in order to defend artists, and I do believe that some of those organizations are working towards that end. Whether or not philosophically we could disagree or agree with copyright in the framing of a capitalist system. I mean, this obviously is a capitalist mechanism, copyright, and we wouldn't need copyright were we to have a functioning non-capitalist system, right? Arguably, which is what we want, hopefully. So yes, it is, but whether or not it's a tool for or against artists, I think is interestingly shift. Much in the same way that free speech used to be a left-wing concern about 25 years ago, and is now a right-wing talking point. That free speech becomes, and culture is interesting like that, right? If it shifts, that's such a small time for that term itself, both of those terms to flipped totally to the opposite side of those discussions.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
One more question coming in here.
Okay.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. I'm an AI researcher, so I'm a professor at an institute called Mila, which develops a lot of the deep learning algorithms that are sort of behind the AI systems. And there's a large, I don't know, cultural influence of the perspective of Silicon Valley and the whole capitalist framework that you've talked about. And I hate all of this. I agree with all of your I agree with your presentation. And I'm often the person in a room trying to convince a bunch of, let's say, tech bros to take work like this seriously. And this is partly a comment and partly a question of like, how do you respond to this? And I don't want to be like adversarial here, but in the same spirit that you've been very, I don't know, frank, I guess, in some of your criticisms of AI. I definitely agree with the statement that artificial intelligence doesn't exist, but making that argument by saying that we don't understand it, I think doesn't make sense to me. Like, we make all kinds of things that we don't understand. Like that's what art is, if you like. So we could very well make an artificial intelligence without understanding anything about AI. And that's kind of what we're trying to do. That's what's happening. And we can disagree or agree about whether super intelligence or AGI or whatever is coming or it's conscious. I think that's beside the point. But the point I'm trying to make is that there are some irrelevant to the ultimate conclusion, technical details that I wouldn't say are wrong, but that would be triggering to a techno-capitalist, the audience that I'm trying to present this kind of work to, that I think undercut the argument. So maybe my question about that, and I'm happy to talk about it with you more, but my question is maybe like, what kind of foundation would you disagree with me that you can make something without understanding it? And can you ground your arguments for AI not even for AI not existing, but for this, for the regressive, sorry, there's an echo and the plug my ears. I really like the presentation you have of the regressive and progressive arguments. On the fly, can you sort of give a foundation that doesn't rely on AI not existing? Or what? Does that make sense of the question?
Yeah. So to answer, so thank you. Thank you for your service in terms of being a person. I'm familiar with Mila and being somebody in the room trying to be doing more kind of positive work in that space must be hard and tiring. So I appreciate the work you're doing. Like I say, this stuff isn't always fun, right? And sometimes you have to have hard.
I appreciated what you were saying about the owning a bunch of echoes.
Yeah. And on the technical side, again, I try to preface things by saying I apologize to people of a technical mind in the room, because I'm like, you're going to be like, yes, but or something like that. But I'm like, I'm attempting to speak to assume nothing about the audience, and so I'm just like, how can I get without misrepresenting the technology? How can I get to like the kind of logical outcomes of how that process works, and give some understanding without basically being like, you must be this tall to ride the roller coaster. You must grasp RNNs at this level to ride the roller coaster. So, it's like I don't want to go down that route. But it's it's a worthy critique. I would say in terms of reproducing something you don't know, I always liken this particular problem to the kind of following. So if you were born in a car and you're driving a car, and all you know of the world is through the car, and all you see of the car is you can't see the feet. You can see your hands on the steering wheel, and you can see out the front, left and right. So you never get out of the car. You're always inside the car. You're driving. You only ever see other cars kind of like at a vast distance, and all you can see is also just into the windows inside their little cockpits as well. Now, if at that point you were said, okay, now without having ever seen a car or knowing anything about really what's inside a car, because it's not catalogued what's inside the car and exactly what's going on there, only vague impressions, reproduce a car, reproduce the PSI on those tires, the treads. What are the tires made of? Like how many wheels does it have? Does it have wheels? What is a wheel? You haven't seen one. That I would say that framing the problem of reproducing intelligence, and I'm not the first, there's many hundreds of years of philosophical thinking on this topic. I mean, easily 2,500 in the non-Western canon. But the West caught up eventually, as it did with some forms of philosophy. But that problem is a really old one. And obviously, there's people within the field who are quite critical of that. I mean, I think Gary Marcus still just about hangs on to the idea of superintelligence, but like I think that even he's kind of cracking under the pressure of it a bit. But I think that the scale of that problem, of that complexity, and of how little we know, and because unlike every other thing we might try to reproduce, we can't get critical distance to this thing. That's the key problem. There is no critical distance between us and intelligence, because the only one we know is ourselves. We don't know that very well. We definitely can't in other people. We regularly don't recognize the intelligence of other people even. Every field that studies intelligence can't agree on this. I would say it's hubristic of the field of AI research to think that they have cracked it, when there is so many fields with such a longer history of engaging with that question, that they're just like, well, yeah, but they don't know. They've not got all the computers that we've got. And that's all it is, really. They're just saying, well, it's just enough compute. It's just compute. More and more compute, more compute, more compute. And obviously that's Sam Altman's a line to get more money, because more compute just means more money, and that's why he's saying we should be exempt from copyright law as well, because then if we're not exempt from copyright, we can't make God, which is what they, him and Masayoshi Son and whoever else, that's what they like to frame, but really it's just, no, they want power or money. It's pretty obvious,
I think what I'm looking for is, so I think I'm too jaded on the AI community to think we will lose enough of that hubris to actually understand the point that you're making. So I want to give up on that, say like AI researchers are going to be incredibly frustratingly hubristic. How can we get them to do the right thing, or a slightly less bad thing anyway?
Got it. I understand your second point now. Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that you can talk about the meaningful carbon impact of generative AI and that those approaches, I mean, obviously generative AI, as you must know, and everybody realistically knows, is a huge bubble, total red herring, is definitely not going to get us meaningfully towards AGI, were that thing to exist. Caveat, I don't think it will, blah, but I think that the recent Nobel Prize may well in the near future be seen as being like, oh wow, we regret that, because this was totally that was totally down the wrong line. Are we going to go back to like perceptrons or something? I don't, but I mean, it's going to be was it neurosymbolic or something will be the next thing, right? I mean, it's just going to be like there's already, and you would know this better than me, but I mean, there's already now people being like, oh, but what neurosymbolic and generative AI? Will that solve the, the real world problem, etc.? But I mean, all it will be is when generative AI is seen to be just like yet another over-promising, under-delivering AI bubble, like all the other ones before, they'll switch into neurosymbolic because then they go, but it's this one. This one's the real one now. This is it. So, but the danger is by the time we get to that, that's still going to be a large, like computationally heavy industry. I think the discussion around like small models, I think is a little bit, I don't trust it. I don't trust who amplifies that narrative, largely the small model discussion. I don't think that it's natively wrong.
Those people, so I'd like to hear more.
This is why I'm like, I don't think it's natively wrong as a concept, and what I understand of it, which is far less than you do. I'm like, I can see where this could go down a better route, but I worry about the other people within your industry who want to amplify that narrative, because my concern is that they're just seeing that as like a bait and switch. Okay, if this didn't work, we're going to do this instead. More money, more money, more money. And it's really the carbon impact that we need to be pushing back on. I don't know. My apologies to you. I think your industry is fucked and bad.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I don't think that every industry yeah, I mean, but like I don't, but I don't think every industry we can stand by and be like, this can be done better. I'm like, actually, I think that some forms of work we should not have done in the first place. It's a very sacrilegious thing to say in secular humanistic cultures like this one, and
totally.
from what I understand of Canada, but but no one wants to hear that. No one wants to hear that that we shouldn't be pursuing a new technology, that progress should not be attached to technological development. That's what got us where we are.
Yeah. So what I'm taking from what you said and from your point about AI being branding, which I like, is not to try to argue, because they don't care about the carbon impact either. Don't fool yourself.
If they did, they wouldn't have started in the first place.
And risk assessment and stuff, but like is to attack their branding, because their branding is that AI is magical, and our new god and all of this stuff. So
that's going to go. I mean, some of that's going to look really bad in maybe about 18. What I mean, Gen AI's got like maybe 9 months before people are really like, no, there's no money here. Like you're asking for 680 billion or whatever, but there is no. That there's so little money in what you're actually trying to frame, except for kind of replacing workers, right?
The problem is they're pivoting already from generative AI to agentic AI.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah. So and like that's just yeah, and that's I mean yeah I don't envy you for your position because you'll see it clearly somebody who cares about these things, and I feel like you may well be trapped in an industry that your livelihood is attached to, and yet you have to do
I'm in academia for a reason.
Oh right, yeah. Well, yeah, solidarity. But yeah, that's difficult. I think it's an intractable problem. I don't think that industry is anyone we should be looking towards for kind of like best practices, because I just think inherently the search I've got a big problem with. I think it centers humanism, again, secular humanism. I think the whole kind of I fucking love science, I'm an atheist type stuff, is like that. They love that singularity bullshit. They love all that, and they're the people who just want to be, not enslaved by Rocco's basilisk type folks, and it's just like I think they're a lost cause, and they're a symptom of this age that we're in, not its driver. They're not the problem, but they are a symptom of it, and I think that there's lots of those symptoms. And much like saying, do you think the fossil fuel industry can play a meaningful part in the future? I'm like, well, it will, but not in a good way, and it won't change until it absolutely has to, and not because they want to, and all those sorts of things. So I'm like, maybe we can spend our energies better in other places, But I don't want to be like, you should quit your job, do something else, but maybe you should quit your job.
No. I mean, what I'm thinking about these days is, and I'm doing a small amount of, is like funneling the AI funding to things that I actually care about and think are worthwhile, like
Right.
They called the Abundant Intelligences Project, which is trying to conceptualize what AI even is, largely indigenous-led perspectives, and then also art projects. And yeah, I think this like just shifting power away for like just leave them out of the room is what I'm trying to do. But I'm also trying to, I don't know, there are some of the Rocco's basilisk people who can be convinced to stop what they're doing.
I mean, if they could be convinced the Rocco's basilisk was real, they could be convinced of loads of stuff, I assume, so it's like, it's good.
Exactly.
Well, please do send me those projects, because no technology is all good or all bad or all neutral, right? And so like, I'm always kind of interested in seeing like really genuinely good applications of these things, because I think it's useful for me to not get lost in the kind of like, oh, it's just all terrible type thing, because I like to remind myself that it's not. So that genuinely sounds good. And particularly indigenous knowledges in relation to code and computational practices. It's a lot of the stuff I'm doing right now. I have a PhD student who's really embedded in that set of logics and is doing great work in that space, Mariana Marangioni. So I'm super interested. So please do send those along, because I'd love to see.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Wesley. We really appreciate you enriching our conversation here at Sparabol and for our audience members. And I'm going to wish everyone a very nice day. And thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.